What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my first impressions for The Witcher, the Enhanced Edition. With the upcoming remake, which is still a ways off to be clear, I'm pretty sure, but with the announced remake of The Witcher 1, I thought it would be a great time to jump into it and cover it on the channel. Though, it is worth mentioning that I am specifying that this is my first impressions with the Enhanced Edition, which I have not played, and it did change a few things. As I did actually play the original all the way back in, I believe it was 2008, after it initially released in 2007. This was one of very few games I was able to play at the time. I had just finished up my freshman year of high school, and I played this on a computer that absolutely could not run it. I remember some of the loading screens taking upwards of 5 minutes. So needless to say, playing it just for this video here has been quite the different experience, for a variety of reasons, but obviously at this point everyone is very familiar with The Witcher, as I would say the third title, combined with several TV shows and the like, have really pushed this franchise into what you would probably consider mainstream. And I mention that because if you've never gone back and checked out the first game, it is definitely not that. It is still a pretty good RPG by pretty much all accounts, but it's certainly quite a bit different from what most people are used to with The Witcher now. But in terms of first impressions, as I mentioned, playing this now is quite a bit different from having played it previously a little after its initial launch. For starters, I think this is either just a lot easier or I've gotten way more used to playing video games, let's say, because I remember when I played this at its launch, it was actually pretty difficult and I could never really wrap my head around the rhythm combat, alongside when to use the potions, etc. But here, I've mostly just kind of been walking through the normal difficulty, and I'll likely have to bump it up for the second playthrough that is probably inevitable. But on that note, it's important to understand that The Witcher 1 is not really an action combat system, although it looks like it is. It's actually mostly stat-based, and you click to attack an enemy at certain intervals in your attack chain to string together combos and deal more damage, as well as swap between various weapon styles. The game itself occupies this very strange place between skill-based and stat-based, and I think this is largely down to its reuse of the Aurora engine, which was also used for Neverwinter Nights, but BioWare allowed CD Projekt Red to actually use it, though it's worth mentioning that substantial changes were made to it, which is why these games don't really feel similar in any way. As rough estimates say, they rewrote about 80% of the Aurora engine to actually make The Witcher 1, which is pretty impressive in its own right. But Neverwinter Nights, another game made with that engine, had a very modular content system where you could play user-generated stuff, and I mention that because something I don't remember at all actually pops up when you hit new game. There are a bunch of little side adventures that you can play from the menu that are relatively short in nature, and they're just kind of one-offs. And there's a handful of these. The Enhanced Edition says that a couple of these are new, but apparently some of these were always here, I guess. And as I mentioned, I don't remember these at all, so it'll be interesting to check those out. But broadly speaking, my first impression has been that it's a little jarring to play through a game like this again so many years later, because I was very familiar with it as I played this a lot, as it was one of the only games that I had access to. So on one hand, a lot of the quests and stuff I remember very, very specifically, and I already know where to go, who to talk to, that kind of thing, but also at the same time, it's clear to me that I didn't understand the combat very well back then, because I'm just walking through this game otherwise. But also, there's a lot that could be said about the world building of this. Now, The Witcher is of course based on novels, and I find that when it comes to video games, that tends to work out very, very well, because then when you enter that video game, it feels like a complete world, as opposed to just an experience that was made specifically for this game. And because of that, as the game kicks off and starts introducing all these things to you, it feels like you're very much so part of a fleshed out world, which I think really helped The Witcher's success along, even if this first game did not do particularly well. But the story kicks off when Geralt of Rivia wakes up outside of Kaer Morhen 5 years after what everyone thought was his death. He took a pitchfork to the gut, died, everybody moved on. 5 years later, you show up out of the blue with amnesia outside of Kaer Morhen. The prologue/tutorial involves Kaer Morhen being robbed by bandits known as the Salamandra, who run off with your mutagens, which are integral to the process of making people into witchers, professional monster slayers, and much of the story revolves around tracking them down. Though, like the other two Witcher games, games, this one's story is relatively standalone and doesn't have a ton of direct connections to the other games. And while there certainly is so much more that could be said about the story here, I'm going to keep this kind of short for the first impressions video, obviously. But it must be said, one thing that I didn't remember was how terrible some of the actual dialogue is. And while the voice acting is hit or miss, sometimes it's pretty good, sometimes it's not good at all, the dialogue is much the same. Sometimes it's not bad, other times it makes little sense and doesn't seem connected to the events that follow. But to wrap this up a little bit and not drone on for too long, to avoid getting into too many details that I'll save for the actual review, my first impressions for the Enhanced Edition are interesting to say the least. So many things are exactly how I remember them with the original, and other things I seem to have been leaning on nostalgia more than the reality, such as I don't remember this dialogue being as bad as it is. But in spite of that, about 15 years later, The Witcher 1 still mostly holds up at first glance. It's definitely clumsy, it feels rough around the edges compared to a lot of stuff today, certainly, but it's still very playable for a first impressions, to be sure. And moving forward, as I go to actually review the title, I'll be playing through it a couple of times, as there are a few choices here and there that change things over the long run, and also just refamiliarizing myself with all the different pieces of the game, which I have no doubt will be an interesting experience after all this time, because just the short bit I've played for this video has been quite the walk down memory lane. But I think it's going to be a good time to go through this game and actually get refamiliarized with what the reality of this game and systems are ahead of its remake that was announced, which is the main reason I'm moving to review this one now finally. So with all of that said, guys, I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe. If you're looking forward to the review, certainly hang around. But regardless of all of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.